This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Usually, tourists come to Germany for the tranquility of the Rhine and the taste of the beer. I came, however, in search of an iconic person. To be more precise, this is a soul-searching journey of rediscovery. Trier in early May is greeted with sunshine and rain. In the Simon Church Square, tourists stand in awe, looking at the imposing statue and Marx's deep gaze, awash with memories of 200 years. In the vineyard of the Marx family, Karl Marx, the philosopher and economist, drinks deep like a god of wine, breeding thoughts of a workers' movement and capitalism in early industrialization. Why was the young Marx so critical of the Prussian authorities as editor-in-chief of the Rhine Times? How can globalization be redefined by his Das Kapital? People from Beijing are testing the loaded legacy of a German thinker's rationality. 200 years on, a faith in practice is taking root. A tour of the local museum, we go back into history that oil paintings seem to have brought to life. Seated in front of a worn-out sofa that Marx used, I could hardly avoid the shadow and mind of a great radical thinker. In his day, freedom was inspired by the massive industrialization which had disrupted traditional ways of production. The rebellion of Marx targeted the old political system, Gone with the Wind. How should we stand up to the force of capital in the dynamic process of globalization? Ignoring history means betrayal. We were told few young Germans know about Karl Marx and his global impact. The erecting of the Marx statue in Trier helps the rediscovery and the rebuilding of the influence of a Marx who might have felt puzzled about the very diverse interpretation of his theories on economics and politics. Mr. Mayor, why has the statue of Marx caused so much controversy locally in his own hometown of Trier?
We had three different discussions. The first discussion was, is it possible to make a statue, to build a statue for Karl Marx? The second discussion was, is it possible to get it as a gift from China? And the third discussion was about, how high, how length, and art, and kind of art we would like to have. I wouldn't discuss about art, and the art discussion is not mine. The first question, is it possible to build a statue for Karl Marx? We had an interesting discussion for 2 years in our city.
The debate lasted for 2 years?
2 years.
Wow. So you are very German.
Yeah, and our city assembly decided yes. Karl Marx is born in Trier, and it's a good idea to have a statue of Karl Marx. The second discussion, as a gift from China. We had a lot of discussion, and again, the city assemblies decided, yes, we take it as a gift, and it's a symbol of friendship.
Very good discussion, and that helps the Chinese understand why it's no easy job to get a job done like the Chinese speed one way or another. So when we look around, we didn't see many Germans. Well, there are some. Yeah. Do you think this is the lingering impact of the Cold War? Because, you know, after the reunification, even before that, Germans didn't have a very good positive, very good voice about the influence of Karl Marx. Yeah. And therefore, you wouldn't expect this statue to attract many German tourists, would you?
We will have German tourists in the beginning of June. A lot of people are on vacation beginning with June. We are, I say it, a touristic hotspot. We have approximately 4.5 million tourists in the city, and a lot of people will have a look to Karl Marx. Of course, it's a problem with the German Democratic Republic. A lot of Germans know Karl Marx, and they know it from German Democratic Republic. And now we have the chance to see Karl Marx as a philosopher, as a politician. Now we have the chance to ask, what does Karl Marx say the society today, and not in the 50s, 60s or 70s?
We understand that this small city of Trier enjoys a long history. It's the oldest city to a degree of your country. So how special is Trier for the cultivation of Karl Marx's mind? I mean, this is something very meaningful and special for the Chinese viewers and indeed those who follow our program.
I made a speech in our city assembly, and I said it's our duty to give Karl Marx a chance 30 years after reunion to see what is his philosophy, what does Karl Marx say to us. It's our duty as the city where he was born.
I mean, how special is the city in terms of its education, its history, its background, its whatever that may have contributed a lot to the development of Karl Marx's mind, which is so critical, philosophical and political about the world.
Of course, it's an old city, it's the oldest city in Germany. We have a heritage, a Roman heritage, and Karl Marx was born in the city at the base of Roman history. And Trier is special because Karl Marx was socialized in Trier. He lived here 17.5 years. He saw poverty in Trier, and he saw how a state doesn't work. And therefore Trier is a place he was born, and we have the chance to ask Karl Marx what is his philosophy today in our society.
I got the impression local Germans prefer to call Karl Marx a freedom fighter, but in the other half of the world, particularly during the Cold War, people who were his followers would call him the spiritual leader of the proletarian class struggle. I mean, why do we have this difference in our interpretation about this iconic man?
It's always the same. It's a discussion between black and white, and whether black nor white is the right opportunity, and therefore it's our duty to see between it's gray, and sometimes Karl Marx is an excellent philosophy, but sometimes he's wrong. We have to differentiate and see what's to do.
The last question is about ideology. Maybe the Social Democratic Party in Germany would still look at Karl Marx as a part of their legacy, one way or another. However, the Cold War came to an end with the Berlin Wall falling down, and do you think there's still the invisible Berlin Wall that separates European democracy from China?
It's hard to say for me. I'm a mayor in a small so-called big city in Germany, and Berlin is far away. But yeah, in some heads is still a wall between East and West. But the young generation is open-minded, and it's easier for me to talk to young people about Karl Marx compared to people in the 50s, 60s or 70s. And the young generation is a chance for us.
In other words, Germany and China share a collective future in terms of how young people would share their interpretations about the Karl Marx in the broader context of globalization, right?
Yeah. For example, my daughter, she stayed 2 years ago for 4 weeks in a family in China. It's a different perspective to a country, to see it from level of a family. It's not only the so-called big politics. It's quite important to meet people, to talk about how works China, how live people in China, how live people in Germany, and it's not only a politic discussion.
Thank you so much. We've not only enjoyed the benefits of doubt, but also benefits of innocence, particularly of the younger people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
"200 years ago, the great thinker Karl Marx was born in an era of upheaval. Isn't this a new long march of rediscovery in Marx's hometown of why and how he had started his probing of capitalism in the adverse circumstances of early industrialization in the UK? What is China's understanding of Marx's thought?" Hi, Professor Zhang.
Good to see you.
We were on the same flight from Beijing to Frankfurt and traveled here together. Now we are right here in the Trier, hometown of Karl Marx. We are so close to Karl Marx, and after years of education about communism and Marxism in mainland China, what can you tell us about your thoughts of the moment?
I'm very excited. On my way here to Trier, I also stopped by Stuttgart to visit the Hegel House. I think this journey is a dream come true to me as someone who spent his formative years in China reading Hegel, reading Marx, but especially Marx. From Trier into the world, I think the slogan rings true. Look at here, this gallery of world revolutionaries. They remind you of Athena leaping out of the head of Zeus. It really indicates the universal impact of Marx's thought, not only in Europe, but also all over the world. Now we are here. It struck me too that Marx, I think he has two identities, especially relevant to Chinese, like you and me. One is that he is first and foremost a European. I don't think we talked about this a lot in China, but think of Marx and his thought, his learning, his intellectual trajectory, his self-education. I think he can be said to be one of the greatest intellectual children of European or Western civilization. He was an avid reader of Greek classics. He learned German idealism by heart. He was a big fan of Shakespeare. He read everything. Through Marx, I think his Chinese followers got a sort of a closer view of entire Western civilization up to even late 19th century. That's his first identity, very distinct when we in China came to Marx. He was a medium through which we read entire Western civilization, but through the important prism of Marxism. The second identity is, of course, he's a leader, a great teacher of the working class. This is the phrase we all learned when we grew up in China. But that indicates something universal. It has nothing to do with any particular nation, any particular race, any particular region. It applies to all people of all places, the proletariat.
Well, Professor Zhang, here is the life or journey of life for Karl Marx. He was born into Trier and years of upheavals that helped to shape his perceptions about the world. He was described by European media as a political refugee, and from cradle to grave. This is indeed the journey of discovery and rediscovery. Tell me how you look at the life of Karl Marx in exile, quote unquote.
It's very interesting. It tells us that at first he was a rebel. He was a radical. He was not to be tolerated by the more traditional conservative social systems in Central Europe. It's only fitting that eventually he found his home, away from home in London. He was in exile for sure, but his mature political, philosophical life was not defined merely by subversiveness. Throughout his life in exile, he was searching for a systematic analysis of the existing social system in order to find a solution, in order to find a program. And that is something we probably should call a very constructive life, even though it was characterized by rebellion and exile.
Karl Marx, the critical voice against the tyranny of Prussian authority, might start from his early years as a journalist. Let's look at what happened back in 1843. He started to work as an editor-in-chief of Rheinische Zeitung or Rhine Times. He was so critical of the local authorities that the newspaper was soon rolled up by the Prussian censorship. Now, tell me why he was so critical.
He was very passionate about what we call freedom of the press today. I think Marx had a very clear idea that while fighting for freedom of the press, he was fighting for everybody. Even though his idea was on the more radical side of the European intellectual or political environment, nonetheless, when he rallied against the Prussian censor, he was on the forefront of not only what was to become a proletarian revolution during or after 1848, but really the continued bourgeois revolution, the bourgeois sort of liberalism and freedom.
Thank you so much.
Well, my dear Friedrich, how many hours, days, and months have I spent in this chair reading in the private library of my London apartment? Whenever I was looking for something, I rolled through the room in this chair. No fun for the floor or the chair. And now I'm sitting here and contemplate what remains. I leave piles of paper. Often I had doubts and was not content with what I had written.
Professor Zhang, look at this one. It's the historical relic of Karl Marx. Don't forget, this is the hometown of Tellier. I think he used this as a chair when he was writing some of the books and publications. And this is also something that testifies to history. My question, however, for you is, in the early 19th century, during the days of industrialization, Marx turned out to be very radical, radically critical of the exploitation of the employers' conditions. But today, what happens in China is a gradualist approach of reform, and this year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Obviously and naturally, we would review relevance of Karl Marx, his prediction and privacy for the application of his theories in present-day China. Why do you think no such things like violence and radical reform, or shock therapy, if you like, have ever taken place over the course of 4 decades? Instead, we opted for something pretty typical of Chinese national conditions in shaping the course of our development and peaceful rise.
Yeah, indeed, I think to that extent, the Chinese state and Chinese Communist Party seem to have transcended in the older sort of classical form of Marxism and Leninism. Chinese Communist Party was guided precisely by these principles when it led the mass revolution to overthrow the so-called the Three Mountains: feudalism, colonialism, imperialism. And those violent struggles paved the way for a kind of a social-economic development, which, historically speaking, fulfilled the necessary conditions for capitalist development witnessed in Europe. That's a classical example. Marx himself maintained that socialism ideally should have emerged from Western Europe and North America, where the economic development was most advanced. But look at even the Western world. They went through this kind of through confrontation between classes, eventually they reached a certain point of reconciliation under rubrics of social democracy, welfare state. From a certain distance, say in China, we look at countries like Germany, we admire its achievement, but oftentimes without knowing or understanding, it's the result of precisely class struggle, as you mentioned, not despite of it, but just because of it. China went on Russia too went on a very different historical path. But I think it's the Chinese understanding of the importance of the state creating the necessary historical conditions for quasi-capitalist development that I think made the Chinese wanted a more gradual, reformist approach when it comes to realization of the importance of developing modern science, technology, economy, and so on and so forth. If you overthrow the state, say, oh, let's switch horses and adopt free market economy in the style of the Russian shock therapy, then what we see would you will have to find a very, very different sort of economic.
Another issue, Xu is that Europe and China are at a different stage of economic and social development. In Europe, very much like across the Atlantic Ocean, where we have the olive-shaped middle-class society, in China, income disparity remains pretty sharp, leading to some of the discrepancies and complaints from the working class. Look at the polarized income and the conflicts between different interest groups. So today, China has a lot to address, perhaps in drafting laws instead of turning to revolution.
Exactly.
Why don't we look at, or take a closer look at the importance of multi-tone thoughts, Deng Xiaoping theory, and even thoughts of Xi Jinping in the new era with Chinese characteristics. How important are these homegrown theories in shaping our perceptions and even the course of development?
I think they're very, very important, and they tend to be understudied, underappreciated. I am, for one, oftentimes confront my Western colleagues who, some of them are extremely dismissive of Chinese Marxism or Chinese socialism, assuming you don't know anything about Marxism, or it's a Western thing, it's a European thing. I think these forms of arrogance will turn out to be just a matter of ignorance. And they're not Marxist in nature at all, because Marxism, to begin with, puts its emphasis on thinking concretely, historically, in terms of contradiction and in terms of a difference, not to adhere to some kind of abstract principle or concept.
By the way, Xu Dong, do you think today we have the idea of proletarian struggles? Because today you don't have exactly the same idea about the working class who don't have any property, who don't have any private ownership. Today, look at even farmers. They have their own farming land.
Absolutely. Farmers are business
city
owners.
Have their own properties.
Yes. But on the other hand, Ray, do you think you and I belong to the working class? Of course, I think we do.
We're the middle class in the Western sense.
We are working men. We are not owners of a means of production.
But
that's the classical.
Are we exploited by the employers?
Well, to some extent.
How should we be protected?
It's a matter of argument. Sometimes we are, sometimes we are not. Sometimes we are exploiters. But
depending on whether we have the surplus labor.
Sticking with the classical Marxist concept, we are not owners of means of production.
Today, after all, labor still serves as a means for earning our bread and butter. It's not for the fulfillment of labor pleasures itself.
Yes.
Perhaps that's a kind of utopianism,
right?
If not communism.
And also, if I may add one point, state employees, I think they constitute a kind of a peculiar category. On the one hand, they also belong to the working men and women. They sell their labor power to the government. But on the other hand, by means of their sort of affiliation with the state, they are not really part of the kind of ordinary labor force. For example, cleaning ladies, they are not part of this. So state plays a very increasingly important role, and that's something we should also take into consideration when we come to re-understand Marxism and Marxist concept of capitalism.
At the height of the Cold War, JFK was in the toilet, and he asked the cleaner of the toilet, "Is it so difficult for you to do the job?" He said, "No. What I do is to make contribution to the lunar landing." And JFK was deeply impressed by the contribution. Hence, he said, not ask what the country can do for you, but ask what you can do for the country.
Yeah. This is exactly what most socialist countries ask from their citizens.
Thank you so much. From the old residence of Karl Marx to a local museum, I decided to take a look at how Marxism had evolved and why Karl was turned into a radical revolutionary and communist prophet through setbacks and very sharp class struggles against the tyranny of industrialization and capitalism. What a wonderful place for the memories of historians. Now, question is, Karl Marx was born in the early 19th century and into years of upheavals. Did that contribute to his radical thoughts as a critical thinker who wrote so many things about the movement of proletarians? Tell me what was happening in those days?
In those days, there was a great movement of opposition in Prussia. And Karl Marx was part of this radical democratic opposition. And then later on, he became a communist in Western Europe.
Then in 1848, he wrote the famous pamphlet, Communist Manifesto. How many versions do you have in this museum about the Communist Manifesto?
In this exhibition, we show 247 manifestos in all sort of languages.
Amazing.
And most of the interesting examples are, we have a translation in French from the daughter of Karl Marx, from Laura Lafargue, and perhaps we have an early manifesto from China. It's from 1938, from the province of Shaanxi. And I think this is very, very interesting to have an early one.
Part of the essence of the Communist Manifesto is this punchline. So far, the history of all human societies is a history of class struggles. But with the end of the Cold War, I'm afraid class struggles ceased to be a convincing point about how we look at the evolution of the society and the progress of the economy.
Yes, it can be, but on the other hand, we can translate class struggle in another language and see that transformations in a society perhaps can fulfill without violence or with violence. So we can speak in another way of those problems, and we see them all over the world. We have sort of struggles, maybe not class struggle in that way of industrialization, but in other forms.
Right, from a revolution through reform. That might be the major story of the 20th century, particularly the closing part of the 20th century. Let's go down history and try to figure out what a real Marx is all about.
Yeah.
Thank you. There are two critical concepts in the theories of Karl Marx about industrialization. One was, of course, the class struggle. The other, surplus value. Now, when we look at the funeral in honor of a worker who was killed in the protests and the strikes, there must be a story behind the movement of dissatisfaction, as well as how that has contributed to the radicalization, quote unquote, of Karl Marx. Can you let me know more?
Well, the radicalization of Karl Marx, I think, began earlier in the time, not during this period of high industrialization, which changed the conditions of labor and changed the conditions of human beings fundamentally.
We don't know how information had been disseminated in those days, and how could Karl Marx be informed about the poor and appallingly poor working conditions of the workers, so that he wrote Communist Manifesto is in fact a declaration against the tyranny of the bourgeois class.
I think it is important to know that this sort of information Karl Marx had was those he read. He read all he could get, but he didn't see the reality of lives at that time. That was Friedrich Engels who saw at Manchester what reality of lives was within his own factors, within his life, but Marx never saw it for himself.
How could Engels come to be a very good friend of Karl Marx, and they trusted each other so much? In fact, Engels helped to finish the second and third volume of Dark Capital. So tell me more about their friendship, how that had been established.
I think those two young men met at Paris, and within a few days they agreed in all what they were thinking. Both of them were left Hegelians, and on the other hand, Engels was a man of the practice, and Marx was a man of the theory. And they put it together, and it worked for a whole life. And Engels always said, well, Marx, this is a genius. I have talent. I'm a talented man, but he's a genius.
The workers' movement was ruthlessly crushed by the Prussian authorities. Many of them were either sent into exile or put on trials. So how could Karl Marx know the trials, the unfair trials, as well as his determination to change the world?
Well, a lot of them, it was in his head and what he was writing in his newspapers. This was the method of Karl Marx, not other things. And the reality of movements was another thing, and only one it get together within the First International.
I believe the message that this oil painting delivers is about the tyranny of the industrialization, as well as why we had this uprising by the workers.
But this is more than that, because this is sort of legend in all history of revolutions. This painting means the adaptation of famous Delacroix painting, which is called Freedom Leading the People. It's of the early French Revolution. And this sort of end of revolutions, this is Paris Commune, but this is sort of end of French Revolution period. And in the tradition of the labor movements in Germany, for example, this sort of French Revolution and the example of Paris Commune was all sort of starting up how to have a social revolution. And a few years or decades later, it was a negative example how not to make a revolution. And therefore, in the French tradition, this sort is the end of all period of the revolutionary century. Because the next revolution, which is starting, was in Russia. It was a revolution of 1905.
So what inspirations did Karl draw from the failure of the Paris Communal uprising?
Well, in my opinion, he had no inspiration because he wrote the famous writing of Interior Struggle, because he wrote it at the end when the commune was failed. So it was a sort of a solidarity address or pamphlet with the failed commune, and not a pamphlet of hope and showing how it should go. But at the end, it was in the opposite, because this writing just was a famous writing, what was a proletarian revolution, or how it started.
And do you think this had delivered an impact on the Russian Revolution?
Maybe, yes. That not only on the Russian Revolution, but in all labor movements, because all sort of labor movements in end of the 19th century, early 20th century, looked at Paris Commune and what was what were the writings of Marx about it, and so that he said this was the starting point for social revolution and the sort of model. Maybe that is sort of inspiration, but I suppose Leni went furthermore because he sort of another idea of revolution and of state for all. And what will be the avant-garde and what will be the dictatorship of proletariat?
Perhaps the failure of this revolution in Paris both contribute to the success of the Russian Revolution and the formation and founding of the Chinese Communist Party in the early 20th century. Thank you so much. By the end of the day, observers share the same concern. Capitalism or communism, which would prevail? Is a liberal democracy the most viable option of social evolution? To take a look at the post-Cold War myth, I'm joined by Madame Bouvier and Professor Zhang Xudong. 200 years on, what Karl Marx failed to predict is that after the two devastating world wars, so the end of the Cold War, in general, people around the world love peace. Most countries have opted for democracy or democratization of their political institutions, except for some countries. Like China, we adopted a way of development very different from Western institutions. The question is, what do you think of the relevance of class struggles and surplus value to essentially important parts in Karl Marx's theories about the society, social evolution, as well as capital itself? First of all, your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want to say, in my opinion, categories as class struggle and surplus value are not helpful for our times. These are, in my opinion, categories of the 19th century and important for the problems of that time. For our times, we have to find other categories to solve our problems. I can't see that Marx's categories are very helpful. What is helpful of him is sort of a method of analyzing problems and to criticize them, but not to solve them.
Given the welfare policies and improvement of labor rights in Europe and much of the world, Professor Zhang, do we see at least shadow and legacy of Karl Marx in the ideology of a Socialist Democratic Party, which is a governing ideology in Europe at least?
Of course, there is a very direct lineage from original Marx thinking to the international, to the social democratic traditions in Europe. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is really the European and North American paths of social development as opposed to Russian, Chinese, and other non-Western forms of social development. That has created a major dichotomy, a major distinction that still defines world politics today. But if I may, I want to go back to this categories of class struggle and surplus value. In my opinion, these categories are not entirely obsolete. They need to be rethought in historically. To that extent, I do agree with you. But however, I think they can also be rethought more broadly and perhaps more philosophically. For instance, I think the value of the notion of surplus value is that this expansion of value, and in 19th century European context, capitalist expansion, is to be found in the moment of production rather than the false equivalence in the marketplace, namely in the realm of exchange value. It's to be found in the process of production of human labor. And this part, I think, is still very instructive, although how we make this notion of a human productivity and its expansion, I think it's up to us. And along with that, this notion of the human productivity, its expansion, its comprehensive development, we can continue to envision a better social system. I think that's part of Marx's inspiration, rather than it's narrowly understood as sort of
another way. I think it is inspiring when you take it for a category of critique, a fundamental critique of what is going on in our societies, and in a different way in each society. We can take it as a sort of analysis category to analyze what is going wrong. And I think this is a lot of, we failed in all this, in all societies we failed, we sort of critique, and we have to rename them or rethink them, but I hope that we find it as another category, because these categories, as we call class struggle, is a little bit for us difficult to take them today as that names.
By the end of the day, I'm afraid, the issue is which will prevail, capitalism or communism? Undeniably, part of the inspirations that Karl Marx got in writing Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital came from the French utopianism, and therefore, long term, since both the capitalist countries and the socialist economy, like in China. You won't call the Chinese economy a socialist economy, but we call it with Chinese characteristics. Anyway, both sides are reflecting seriously upon what can be done to improve, for example, the flawed Western liberal democracy. You cannot deny the negative impact of populism in continental Europe. And in the United States, you can also feel the impact of populism. So do you think there's a margin for communism as an ideology to improve and gain the upper hand in competition for what the future might be like?
Well, I can't imagine that communism could be it, because we can't forget the failed states of communism in Europe. We can't forget the Soviet Union and in Middle Europe, or in Europe, the failed state. Might be that anything happen that is sort of controversy or a system which is opposed to capitalism can exist. But it has been another name, because we can't go back to what we have. And the capitalism showed us for 2 decades too that it can change itself. And if there's anything like populism or other dangers perhaps, can make that capitalism will change itself.
Communist movement may have ceased to deliver the huge impact that we had in the years of Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, or even Leninism in the Soviet era. However, don't you think, as a symbol of labor rights and the success of so many labor rights movements, socialism as part of communism or early form of communism has prevailed in Europe? Look at the idealism and the ideology of a socialist democratic party here in Europe. So do you think there's still silver lining for a socialist movement and eventually culmination of such a movement in what is called manifestation of communism?
Personally, I don't think it's a matter of making predictions, or it's just a matter of...
Karl Marx was viewed as a prophet.
Well, that's one of the most terrible things you can say. A prophet, in my view, is part of the Bible and nothing else. And Marx was not a prophet. He was an analyst who could analyze what he saw in his time, and he could see the development of his time. But he couldn't predict what will happen in 50 years ago. Nobody can do it at our time. And Karl Marx was not a prophet. It was the early labor movement who made a prophet of him, because they needed anything, a sort of prophet or a system would help when it was suppressed. but sort of a religion they needed at the moment, but he was not a prophet. It's written nowadays, every day you can read Karl Marx, wasn't he right and he was a prophet or anything like that? He was not. He was a very, very fundamental critique of his time. He was an analyst, and he saw clearly how capitalism developed.
What makes Marx and Marxism relevant today comes mainly from the fact that Marxism remains the most ambitious, systematic, and probably most profound analysis of capitalism, of the capitalist system. So as long as capitalism remains alive, productive, creative, in good or bad ways, Marxism's relevance is not going to fade away. But the power comes from its analytical power, yep, from its structural insight into the basic fundamental contradictions of the system. So as long as there are internal structural contradictions of capitalism as a system, we as Marxists will have a lot to do. So,
but even as non-Marxist, I'm not a Marxist. I agree with that, because this is an instrument. Marx gave us an instrument to analyze the system, and we can do it every day as Marxists or not Marxists. And that is, in my opinion, what is the importance of Marx today. For non-Marxists or for Marxists?
Yes, I agree. And going back to your earlier question about referring to the sort of competition between different social systems and the different ideologies, I think a sort of a Marxist way of thinking through this question would be something like this. It's not really about which ideology, which intellectual discourse, which philosophical system will prevail, or even it's not about which particular social political system or institution will prove to be the most appealing, but rather, and China is a very good case in point, but rather which system allows a continuous development of social and human productivity. Which system is best suitable for releasing the human potential, the social productivity, rather than muffling it or putting it under some kind of a yoke. So China today, its success, the success of the Chinese system, I think lives and it dies with whether or not this continued social productivity, from industrialization to post-industrialization to newfound social freedom to newfound human creativity, all these things, whether this system as a totality will allow this continued revolution or transformation in the domain of forces of production. And I think the recent speech given by the Chinese President Xi Jinping has his finger right on this issue. It's really about the communist revolution in China is loyal to the original Marxist doctrine, in the sense that it regards itself as an agent of change, as a guardian of this revolution in the domain of forces of production, which will, by itself, transform the social system, transform religion, culture, ideology, even art.
Perhaps as we are in the hometown of Karl Marx, our discussions have been restricted by the image and influence of Karl Marx himself. Why don't we broadly refer to the importance and influence of Confucianism instead of communism in shaping the future of China, and indeed most of the Asian cultures in the other half of the globe, the Eastern Hemisphere?
I don't know. You can talk about, we don't know enough of Confucianism.
And do you think the success story economically, ideology and politics aside, do you think the success story of China will put an end to the end of history? Because Francisco Fukuyama proudly said, liberal democracy prevails with the end of the Cold War.
But we know that Fukuyama, we can't agree. There is no end of history. We can't see it.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. Thanks a lot. A balanced panel discussion with the elegant French Madame Bouvier in Trill led to a trip to a local vineyard that had been owned by Karl Marx's father. We need to trace Karl's thoughts to the spirit of wine in Greek culture. Andrew, perhaps the best starting point of our journey of rediscovery about Karl Marx is the vineyard.
Yeah,
he was born into a very wealthy family. His father was the richest guy here. So how come he had chosen this path of defending the poor, turning himself from a lawyer to a philosopher? He became a poor, if not penniless, for a while.
Well, you know, he was always out of money, but he lived a very bourgeois life. He had a flat, or he was living in a house.
See, this is a paradoxical life.
His kids went to private school, and they gave ballrooms, etc. He had people working in his household, but he was always out of cash. At the same time, I think he saw a lot of misery around himself, etc., and that sort of dedicated him to work for the poor.
And he was never aware that his theories were cashed into revolutionary acts by Soviets, Russians, and the Chinese.
Well, he hoped for these ideas taken into revolution. It was the dictatorship of the poor that he had foreseen, but not by Russia or the East Germany, etc. That, of course, he didn't know, and they actually perverted his theory. So maybe at the end he failed. So Marx certainly hoped for his ideas to be transformed into a revolution, but not the way Russia or East Germany did it. He was hoping for the dictatorship of the poor and oppressed, but I think these two states perverted his ideas.
We know wine is an important part of your lifestyle in Europe, this part of the bourgeoisie lifestyle. But Marxism has been viewed as a soul of proletarian class struggles. How important is wine for much of the intellectual life for Karl Marx? Because he wrote many important articles in Trill, his hometown, while being the son of a rich guy, owner of a vineyard here.
Well, he definitely enjoyed wine. He gave it to Friedrich Engels and others when they had family affairs. He sent a barrel of wine, for example. So he knew, but for him it was sort of a source of money, a source of capital. He didn't need to drink alcohol to write his ideas. His mind flourished, his brain flourished. But on an intellectual side, I think wine goes very well with literature and philosophy.
Karl was involved in the family disputes on the heritage after his father died. What was the solution? Why he was also involved in a dispute about the asset division? Because he is a defendant of proletarians, and he should have cared nothing about property, right?
Well, you know, with intellectuals, usually they've got two sides of a coin. They don't have to live the lifestyle they describe. And he was certainly a kind of a bourgeois nature. He lived with his family in a flat at a big house. They had ballroom parties, private school for the kids. They had service people, etc. Didn't stop him from describing what he saw around him. But certainly he would not like to live the life of the people he described, etc. It was his theory, and he was hoping for the theory to be working. Finally, if he had survived his ideas, or he had seen how his ideas had been transferred into revolution, maybe the revolution would have him, the creator of his theory, blasted away with it. Und zu Ehren von Karl Marx singen wir jetzt die Internationale.
I thought that communism or Marxism was the universal language. In fact, with the end of the Cold War, wine remains the undisputable, unquestionable universal language. So let's celebrate the...
Völker, höret die Signale, auf zum letzten Mingefeld, international, 就一定要实现。
Campaign.
Liviamo negli lieti corici che la bellezza infiora e là fuggevo l'ora si devia voluta liviam nei dolci fremiti che suscita l'amore poiché